A garden that yields the sweetest fruit is often tended by a hand that remains hidden in the dirt. And I learned that the people who enjoy your harvest are often the first to forget the person who planted the seeds. My name is Clara. At 45, I am the woman everyone in the prestigious neighborhood of Emerald Crest calls when they need perfection. I don't own a company. I own a reputation. I am the community architect, the person who organizes the charity galas, the one who knows which doctor to call at midnight, and the one who has saved more marriages and reputations in this town than anyone would dare to admit. I did it because I believed in community. I did it because I thought these people were my friends. But friendship in Emerald Crest is a currency, and I didn't realize that my friends had been spending my kindness without ever intending to pay it back. The first sharp turn in my life happened during the planning of the Azure Heart Foundation fundraiser, the biggest event of the year. For a decade, I had been the silent force behind its success. But this year, a newcomer named Lydia, a woman 20 years younger with a smile like polished porcelain, arrived. She didn't have my experience, but she had something I had overlooked, the ability to mirror people's vanity. The emotional dip was brutal and sudden. At the final committee meeting, Beatrice, a woman I had known for 20 years and whose legal scandal I had personally covered up just months prior, stood up and made an announcement. We've decided that the Azure Heart needs a fresh, modern face this year. Lydia will be taking over as the lead coordinator. Clara, we think you deserve a break. You've been doing this for so long, maybe you've lost that spark the donors are looking for now. The room went silent, but it wasn't a shocked silence. It was a calculated one. I looked around the table at faces I had comforted, people I had loaned money to, and families I had protected. Not one person spoke up for me. In their eyes, I saw not gratitude, but a cold, clinical dismissal. I was no longer useful to their social climb, so I was being discarded like last season's fashion. The pain was a cold, hollow ache in my chest. I had spent my life building their world, and with one sentence, they had evicted me from it. But they forgot one thing. I wasn't just the person who organized their parties. I was the person who held their secrets. For 15 years, I had been the vault where the scandals of Emerald Crest were kept. I knew who was hiding debt, who was being unfaithful, and whose perfect children were anything but. I had kept those secrets out of loyalty, but as I walked out of that meeting, the weight of that loyalty lifted, replaced with a calm, icy clarity. If they wanted to see what life was like without my spark, I would gladly show them. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply smiled, wished Lydia the best of luck, and went home to my quiet cottage on the edge of the estate. I knew the Azure Heart fundraiser was a logistical nightmare that only I knew how to navigate. I knew that the vendors, the donors, and the local authorities cooperated because of their personal trust in me. By removing me, they hadn't just changed the face of the event, they had pulled the foundation out from under the building. I sat in my garden that night, the moon reflecting off the silver tea set Beatrice had given me years ago as a thank you for saving her reputation. I realized that my revenge wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be a scandal. It would be a lesson in the value of the invisible hands that hold a world together. I was going to let them succeed or fail on their own merits, and I knew, better than anyone, that their merits were as hollow as their promises. Lydia, I whispered to the wind, you wanted the spotlight. I hope you're ready for how bright it gets when the walls start to crumble. The first thread had been pulled, and the tapestry of Emerald Crest was already beginning to unravel. The weeks following my retirement from the committee were quieter than any I'd known in years. I spent my mornings tending to my roses, watching the frantic activity across the street through the gaps in my hedge. Without my intervention, the smooth machinery of Emerald Crest was beginning to grind and spark. Lydia was discovering that a porcelain smile couldn't negotiate with a disgruntled caterer or manage a complex seating chart where every guest had a historical grudge against another. The first major dip in their new era happened when the primary donor for the Azure Heart, a reclusive billionaire named Mr. Sterling, suddenly withdrew his support. Lydia had sent him a generic, modern digital invitation, failing to realize that Mr. Sterling only responded to handwritten notes on cream-colored parchment, a detail I had carefully observed for a decade. Within 48 hours, the foundation was short by $300,000. The panic was inevitable invisible to most, but to me, the silence coming from the committee office was deafening. The emotional tension escalated when Beatrice appeared at my doorstep one evening, clutching her designer handbag like a life raft. She didn't come with an apology, she came with a demand disguised as a request. "Clara, darling," she said, stepping into my foyer without waiting for an invitation, "Lydia is having a bit of a technical struggle with the donor list. It seems some of the contact information is missing. Since you have all those files, could you just hand them over, for the sake of the charity, of course?" I looked at Beatrice, the woman who had led the charge to replace me, and felt a wave of profound clarity. The files she wanted weren't on a computer, they were in my head. I knew which donors needed a phone call before 10 a.m. and which ones required a specific vintage of wine to be sent to their homes. I knew the secrets that made them say yes. "I'm so sorry, Beatrice," I replied, my voice as calm as a still lake. "But as Lydia mentioned, I'm on a much-needed break. I've deleted my professional logs to give her a clean slate. I wouldn't want to interfere with her modern vision. I'm sure a fresh perspective is exactly what the foundation needs to find new donors." The look on Beatrice's face was worth every year of silent service I had given her. It wasn't just frustration, it was the first realization that they hadn't just fired a coordinator, they'd lost their shield. She left my cottage with a forced smile that couldn't hide the cracks in her composure. As the days passed, the dominoes continued to fall. The local flower shop, which I had helped during their bankruptcy 5 years ago, refused to provide the centerpieces at the special rate Lydia demanded. The security firm I had recommended suddenly had no availability for that weekend. One by one, the bridges I had built with my own hands were being raised, not out of my command, but because those people were loyal to me, not the name of the foundation. I watched from my porch as the committee members began to turn on each other. Whispers of Lydia's incompetence began to circulate through the neighborhood. The same whispers they had used against me now turned inward. The emotional roller coaster was no longer mine to ride. I was the one watching it from the ground. I realized then that true power isn't about standing on a stage. It's about being the person everyone realizes they can't live without, only after you've walked away. But the most significant blow was yet to come. Lydia, in her desperation to fill the financial gap left by Mr. Sterling, made a secret deal with a development firm called Opal Ridge Estates. She didn't know that Opal Ridge Estates was the same company that tried to demolish our local park 3 years ago, a project I personally blocked by using a well-placed secret about the CEO's past. By inviting them in, Lydia had opened the gates to a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the neighborhood was about to find out that fresh energy often comes with a very high price. I sat in my library that night, a single candle burning, and opened a small, locked drawer in my desk. Inside was a collection of envelopes, not for blackmail, but for insurance. I wasn't going to destroy Emerald. I was going to let it see itself in the mirror without the filter I had provided for so long. "Be careful what you wish for, Beatrice," I whispered, closing the drawer. "You wanted a world without my spark. Now you're going to find out how dark it gets when the fire goes out." The news of the partnership with Opal Ridge Estates hit the neighborhood like a sudden freezing rain. To the outside world, it looked like a generous corporate sponsorship that saved the Azure Heart fundraiser. But to those of us who knew the history of the land, it was a calculated takeover. Lydia had accepted their money, and in return, she had given them the one thing they'd been eyeing for years, a seat at our private planning council. She thought she had found a savior. She didn't realize she had sold the keys to the kingdom for a temporary spotlight. The emotional weight of this betrayal began to ripple through the community. Families who had lived in Emerald Crest for generations were suddenly receiving notice of interest letters from Opal Ridge, suggesting that their back lawns might soon be overshadowed by high-rise luxury condos. The very people who had looked down their noses at me during that final committee meeting were now standing on their porches, clutching those letters with trembling hands. The fresh energy Lydia brought into the room was now threatening to demolish the very peace I had spent 15 years protecting. One afternoon, a group of neighbors, the same ones who remained silent when Beatrice dismissed me, approached my garden gate. They didn't come with flowers or apologies. They came with a desperate, frantic energy. "Clara, you have to help us. Opal Ridge is moving their surveyors onto the park grounds tomorrow. Lydia says it's part of the revitalization agreement she signed. She won't listen to us. She says we're being old-fashioned." I didn't open the gate. I continued to prune my lavender, the scent filling the air between us. It's a beautiful afternoon, isn't it? I found that being old-fashioned has its perks. For instance, I have so much more time to enjoy my garden now that I'm not managing the neighborhood's legal disputes. I'm sure Lydia, with her modern vision, has a plan to handle the surveyors. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that I wasn't going to be their shield this time. Not for free, not without the respect that had been stripped away. They left my gate not with anger, but with a profound sense of loss. They were beginning to understand that my spark wasn't just about party planning, it was about the invisible walls I had built to keep the intruders out. The roller coaster took another sharp turn that evening when Arthur, the local councilman, and another member of the committee called me. His voice was hushed, urgent. "Clara, I've seen the contract Lydia signed. She didn't just give them a seat. She gave them an exclusive easement through the historic district. If this goes through, Emerald Crest will never be the same. Beatrice is in hysterics. We need that information you have on the Opal Ridge CEO, the one you used to stop them 3 years ago." I leaned back in my armchair, the shadows of the library dancing on the walls. "Arthur," I said softly, "that information was a gift of loyalty, and as you all made clear, that loyalty has been retired. I've decided to be like a precious gemstone, valuable but only available to those who truly appreciate the cost of keeping it safe." I hung up before he could respond. I wasn't being cruel. I was being an architect. To build something new, sometimes you have to let the old rotted structures fall. I knew that Opal Ridge's move was aggressive, but I also knew their weakness. I had spent years documenting the environmental violations they had covered up in other districts, secrets I had kept as a professional courtesy to the local legal community. As the sun went down, the first surveyors arrived at the park, their bright orange vests a stark contrast to the elegant greenery. The neighborhood was in a state of quiet panic. Beatrice was seen pacing her balcony, her perfect life suddenly looking very fragile. Lydia was nowhere to be found, likely realizing that the modern world she courted didn't care about her porcelain smile once the checks had been cashed. I opened my desk drawer and took out a single, unmarked envelope. It wasn't addressed to the committee, it was addressed to the local press, a journalist I had mentored years ago. But I didn't send it, not yet. I was waiting for the moment when the lesson would be most effective. I wanted them to feel the cold wind of the world they'd invited in. I wanted them to realize that the person they'd discarded was the only one holding the roof over their heads. "The foundation is cracking, Beatrice," I whispered, looking out towards the park. "I hope you've learned how to build a shelter because the storm you invited is just getting started." The morning the heavy machinery rolled into the Emerald Crest Park was the morning the neighborhood finally woke up from its dream of perfection. The sound of diesel engines and the rhythmic thud of surveyor stakes being driven into the earth replaced the usual chirping of birds. For the first time in its history, the prestige of our community felt cheap, bought and sold by a girl who didn't understand that some things are more valuable than a balanced budget. Lydia was seen arguing with the foreman near the fountain, her voice high and strained, a sharp contrast to the calm, controlled image she had projected just weeks before. The rising tide of consequences took another sharp turn when the first tree fell, a 100-year-old oak that had been the center of our garden parties for decades. As it crashed to the ground, a collective gasp seemed to rise from the surrounding villas. I watched from my upstairs window, my heart heavy for the tree, but my mind focused on the lesson. Beatrice was there, standing on the sidewalk, weeping openly. She looked older, the stress of the impending legal disputes and the loss of her social standing etching lines into her face that no expensive cream could hide. She didn't come to my gate this time. She sought me out with a broken spirit. When she finally knocked on my door, the woman who stood there was the shadow of the one who had dismissed me. "Clara," she whispered, her voice cracking, "the park is just the beginning. Opal Ridge has filed for a rezoning of the entire north sector. They want to turn the historic clubhouse into a commercial hub. Lydia, she didn't read the fine print. She signed a global development waiver. We're going to lose everything." I invited her in, not out of pity, but for the final act of the architecture I'd designed. I served her tea in the same silver set she had given me, the steam rising between us like a veil. "You wanted a modern face, Beatrice," I said, my tone neutral, devoid of malice. "You wanted efficiency and a fresh spark. You got exactly what you asked for. Lydia is efficient. She found a donor when no one else could. She has a spark. She's effectively dismantling the whole neighborhood's peace to keep her vision alive." Beatrice put her head in her hands. "Please, I know you have the leverage. You told Arthur you had documentation on the Opal Ridge CEO. Tell me what it is. I'll pay you. I'll make sure you're reinstated as the permanent head of the council. Anything." I leaned forward, the firelight catching the gray in my hair, a badge of the decades I had spent protecting people who didn't deserve it. "I don't want your money, Beatrice, and I certainly don't want my old job back. I've realized that being the community architect was a cage of my own creation. I was so busy protecting your secrets that I forgot to live my own life." I took a single manila folder from the side table and laid it on the lace cloth. "This is just about the CEO's past. This is a record of every environmental bypass Opal Ridge has committed in the last 5 years, cross-referenced with the private land grants that protect Emerald Crest soil. If this reaches the State Environmental Board, their permits won't just be paused, they'll be revoked permanently." Beatrice reached for it, her eyes lighting up with a desperate hope, but I placed my hand on the folder. "There's a price, Beatrice, but it's not for me. To save the park, you have to admit the truth. You have to stand in front of the community and tell them that you sacrificed their stability for your own vanity. You have to tell them that you dismissed the person who protected them because you were tired of feeling indebted to her honesty." The internal struggle on her face was a masterpiece of conflicting emotions. For Beatrice, her image was her life. Admitting she was wrong felt more difficult than losing the park. But as the sound of a distant machinery echoed through the open window, she realized she had no choice. The momentum of the crisis had reached its peak, and she had to face the reality she created. "I'll do it," she whispered, the words sounding like a confession. "Good," I replied, handing her the folder. "And Beatrice, make sure Lydia is there to hear it. She needs to learn that a bridge built on betrayal is the first one to collapse when the storm hits." As she left, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. I wasn't just seeking a personal victory. I was teaching them the value of the invisible threads that hold a society together. Integrity isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. And without it, even the most beautiful mansion is just a pile of expensive bricks waiting to fall. The true measure of a person is not how they act when they are in power, but how they behave when the walls are closing in and the only way out is through the truth. The emergency community meeting at the Emerald Crest Clubhouse was unlike any gathering I had seen in 15 years. There were no champagne flutes, no forced laughter, and no expensive floral arrangements. Instead, the room was heavily filled with the scent of rain-soaked coats and the electric tension of a community on the brink of losing its core values. I sat in the very back row, a quiet observer in a simple knit sweater, watching as the world I had protected prepared to face its reflection. Lydia was on the stage, her voice trembling as she tried to defend the Opal Ridge partnership. She looked fragile, her porcelain image cracked by the reality of the construction equipment parked outside. "It was a financial necessity," she cried out, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The fresh energy she had promised had turned into a destructive situation, and the neighbors were looking for accountability. That was when Beatrice stood up. The room went silent. For a moment, she looked at me, a long, searching gaze that acknowledged the debt she could never truly repay. Then she turned to the audience. She didn't use the polished, condescending tone she had used to dismiss me weeks ago. She spoke with a raw, painful honesty. She admitted to her vanity, her desire for a modern face to hide her own insecurities, and how she had discarded the one person who truly held the neighborhood's interests at heart. "Clara didn't fail us," Beatrice said, her voice echoing through the hall. "We failed her, and in doing so, we opened our gates to people who view our home as nothing more than a profit margin." As Beatrice handed over the documentation I had provided, the atmosphere in the room shifted from panic to a cold, focused resolve. The environmental violations and legal discrepancies within the Opal Ridge contract were undeniable. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the local authorities had issued a stop work order that effectively halted the development project. The crisis had been averted not by a loud confrontation, but by the quiet power of the truth. The emotional resolution followed quickly. Lydia left the neighborhood within the week. She didn't leave with a scandal. She simply faded away, realizing that in a community built on history and trust, a person without deep roots cannot survive the pressure. The fresh energy was gone, leaving behind a neighborhood that was perhaps a little less shiny, but a lot more authentic. A few days later, a formal delegation of neighbors came to my cottage. They didn't ask me to come back to the committee. They knew that bridge had been crossed. Instead, they came to ask for my forgiveness and to present a proposal to turn the damaged part of the park into a permanent community sanctuary named in my honor. They had finally learned that my spark wasn't a commodity to be traded. It was a service of love. I looked at their faces, Beatrice, Arthur, and the others. They were different now. The secrets I had kept for them were still safe, but the dynamic had changed. I was no longer their servant. I was their teacher. I had shown them that a house is just a building, but a community is an architecture of trust. "I accept your apology," I said, a soft smile touching my lips as I looked at my garden, which was once again peaceful. "But I won't be returning to the council. I've decided to spend my time building something new, a legacy that doesn't rely on shadows." The journey had finally reached its destination. I had watched my world crumble, and I had watched it be rebuilt on a stronger foundation. My reward wasn't in their downfall, but in their growth. I had taught them that the hand that tends the dirt is just as important as the hand that picks the fruit. As I closed my garden gate that evening, I felt a profound sense of freedom. The secrets were still there, locked away in the drawers of my mind, but they no longer held me captive. I was Clara, the woman who knew the cost of a beautiful life, and the woman who finally knew how to live one on her own terms. In the end, I thought, looking up at the stars above Emerald Crest, the true beautiful secret of all is that you don't need to be in the spotlight to be the light.